named Kind, and I am one of the instructors and director at Garnish London. So today I am going to be spending this hour just talking about Logic and how you can use synths in Logic, and just generally how you can use synths in a more interesting way. I think one of the things that people get a little bit shell shocked by is there's obviously loads of buttons, there's lots of controls in synths, there's lots of different facets to them. You can't really just open a synth up, and I guess you can just play, but if you want to sound design properly, it's quite, there's something to it. So I'll kind of do a little bit about what synths are and how you can use them, but mainly it's going to be about what synths are there in Logic, how can you use them in a good way, and just some little tricks to kind of make them feel a little bit more like analog synths, which is really what everyone wants, I guess. So yeah, let's have a look at what synths we've got going on here. So our first primary synth in Logic, I guess, is what's called Alchemy. Now, Alchemy is a piece of kit that was added about, I think, maybe 3 years ago into Logic, and I think it was bought off another company because it's a pretty complete design. But you can see here, if you open it up, you've got a massive range of sounds in here that you can draw on quite quickly. If you hear anything in the background, I've got my little doggy who's walking around in the studio with me. Come on. Say hi to the folks on Garnish TV. So this is Mr. Bibbs, who's my dog. He also loves synths. So go on, run away. Okay, so yeah, when you bring up the main menu on Alchemy like this, you've kind of got your main window, which has your categories, your subcategories, and all this is doing, the browser, is just helping you narrow down your sounds. So I think in here you can see at the top right, there's 3,500 presets in Alchemy. So all the browser window is doing is just trying to help you choose those in an easier way. So on the left hand side, you've got your kind of core instruments. So let's just say I want to use some pads. And then you've got subcategories, so you can choose things like vocal, analog feel, that kind of stuff. I kind of find that I tend to use the two on the right. So either I know that I'm working in a certain genre, if you work in multiple genres like I do, and okay, so in this case I might want ambient, for example, or I know that I kind of roughly want something, so if I want something to add a bit of warmth into the sound, then I can go to warm. And what that does on the right hand side is it basically narrows down those 3,500 presets to, in this case, 228. So that's a really simple way of getting sounds up. Now, once we've just chosen the sounds, say I want analog silk, right? It sounds pretty nice. I've chosen that. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Where are we? Sounds pretty cool. It's kind of got a bit of a synth wave vibe to it. So, straight out the bat, these sounds are pretty nice. But what you can do now is you can use this bottom pane to then change that sound into something you want. Now, if you want to kind of use less space, or you're working on multiple plugins at the same time, once you've found the thing that you want, you can go to simple at the top here and just see the bottom of the plugin. Now this allows you to just kind of focus on the sound itself rather than just constantly staring into the abyss of the browser. So let's just say we're working in simple. Now the first thing with this is that you've got a 8 box on the left here, and each preset in Alchemy has 8 presets kind of within the preset. So this one's called Analog Silk, but there's also rich brassy, light brassy, thin bright, and they're all sub presets of Analog Silk. So if I play, I'm going to record a really quick loop into Logic, and then let's just have a listen if I start playing with those presets. Cool, so I'm just going to quantize that. Okay, so now I'm going to start moving between my presets. Different. Tinier, sits higher in the frequency range. Still nice though. A lot more bite on this one, but much richer. Kind of sits more like a lead part. Got like a thinner version here, more of a sine feel. So you can see with this, right, they're adding effects in now as well. You've got a tremolo being added there. I guess this one's probably going to be some kind of step filter. Yeah, you can feel there's like a kind of rhythmic tremolo effect. So you get like some really nice ideas going here, right, in terms of like how you can move the sound. One of the things that I think is best about this is that you can actually blend the presets as well, because all the presets, if you look on the right hand side of this screen, are just like, you know, versions of settings on this, and in particular using these XY axis. If I start moving this, you can just see the same same settings just move around. What you can do is you can drag between presets, and that allows you to get a much more complex sound that's like really tailored to what you want. So let me just start in Rich Brassy, and let's just feel out like maybe a spot between these four that I like. So for me, that's getting like the low richness of the dark brassy part with the bite of the high one. So you've got like a lot of different sound going on there. So I've gone from this to this. So this is one of the best things about Alchemy, is that like you've kind of got this like endless possibility thing going on here, because I guess if we go back to the browser window, you know, you had 3,500 presets. We've now gone down to 228. But really you're kind of timesing that by 8 and then by the combinations of the 4 that you can get. So there's loads of stuff going on here that, you know, isn't obvious at first. So yeah, so let's just look at some of the other things here. Even if you do find the part that you like, what you can then do as well is you can start to like play with the actual presets themselves. So if you want more reverb, you can add more reverb in. If you want to increase your what's called your resonance, you can do that. We'll come back to resonance in a bit because we need to explain what that is. And you can just kind of like change the general parameters that you would on a normal synth: ADSR, cutoff, reverb, cutoff, resonance, that kind of stuff. I'll come on to that in a little bit, because I appreciate if you've not really worked with synths a lot of that's going to be jargon. So we'll come back to that. All right, cool. The other thing with Alchemy is you can save your own settings. So if you go up to the top, you've got save and save as. If I wanted to save this, I could change that. Little known thing as well, you can also change the quality in Alchemy as well. So if you've got a real beast of a machine that like can handle it, you can put the quality in ultra. And what that'll actually do is just bring up like the quality of the oscillators and the sounds that they're using. And if you're trying to like, you know, really get the most out of it and your machine can handle it, that's a nice little way of just pushing that up as well. Cool. So just to kind of look a little bit deeper into Alchemy, we won't go to, oh, I accidentally set it off. We won't go too much into this, but in the back end as well, if you see down here on the left, I've got Perform, which is like the bit I was using to tailor my sound. I've got Arp, which is basically an arpeggiator, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. And we've got effects. So I can also start to route like different effects like delay. I've got different things down here as well. So like your arpeggiator, which I'm going to come back to the Logic one later, is basically a way of building arpeggios out of a chord that you play. So to give you an example of this, if you've not heard an arpeggiator before, I can choose a mode. In this case, I want the arpeggiator to go up. So rather than going like this, just going to choose one that's a little bit less ringy. So I'm going to just go to like key. We'll go to yeah, keys for the minute, and I'll just try something like this. Cool. So that's what it sounds like normally, but I'm playing C, E, G, and C. So if I go up, then what's going to happen is my arpeggiator is going to then play that arpeggio up the chord for me. So you can hear it just the whole time, right? Obviously, you've got different settings here, down, up, down. You can move it around. Up, down, for example, would go up and then down. So you can change that. I can also change how many octaves I want it to play over. So if I want to go like 3 octaves, it will go all the way up. So this kind of sounds a bit twee at the moment, just because it's like out the box. But you get the idea here. Like if you've got a part and you want to create like a layer or whatever it is and make some movement in that part, like an arpeggiator is a really great way of achieving that. So the arpeggiator is back here as well. And then in your effects as well, you've got lots of different ways of building an effects rack here. So what you can see is that like I've got 3-band EQ, fat compressor, which is just a Logic thing for a it's just a Logic term for a type of compressor that they've got built in as a plugin. And then they've got the reverb on the right. So whatever I select here is then being put into a rack here that I can then start to work on. So if I want to, for example, you know, like take, I don't know, more low end out in the EQ, I can bring this down and it will thin out my sound. Equally, I can go in and like do the amount of compression I want, or I can go in and like change my reverb. So I appreciate if you're coming to this cold and it's a bit of a first time into synths, like there's a lot going on here. But if you are familiar with effects, like building an effects rack in Alchemy is another level of control that you've got over your sound design. And ultimately, it's just another thing for you to personalize, which is great. So yeah, if you are looking to add anything else, they've got lots of different effects in here as well, and you can just build more or less of what you want in. So so we've gone from kind of simple level, which is browser, through to the actual simple view, which is like your perform view, where you can choose your sound. And now we're kind of getting like a little bit more advanced with like your effects. Now you'll notice there is an advanced setting on Alchemy as well. And what this will allow you to do is really get into like some kind of hardcore synthesis here. Now, at a beginner level, I'm not going to go too much into this, but the great thing about Alchemy, which a lot of people don't know, is that you actually have multiple types of synthesizer in Alchemy. So on the one hand, you've got like regular, subtractive, additive, that kind of stuff, but you've also got like granular synthesis in there, which is something that I think a lot of people think you can't do in Logic. So I know Granulator and Ableton is obviously an amazing plugin. If you are looking to do granular in Logic, this is the way you do it. So if you, for example, have a sample, let's just take a like this, for example, my acoustic strum. I'm going to drag it straight over here, and you can see that it's giving me 3 different options in Alchemy. So I can make a sample out of the sample that I've selected, the Apple loop, or I can change it into an Alchemy-based instrument. So if I drop it onto oh sorry, look, I was looking for granular there, but let me just unload that. Cool. So you can see here it's added as an additive synth, which I won't go into now. But if I now add this in as granular, then what it does is it basically gives me up here a granular synth. So you can see up the top right here, I've got sampler, I've got granular, and I've also got the ability to change pitch, form, and all that stuff if you get into it. But now, for example, with this sound, I can start to break down like you know, grains of that sound. I can change the position, I can change the speed. Let's try and get some so if I was looking for like a loop there, like as more of a pad effect, I can start to draw that kind of thing in. So it's just another feature of Alchemy where you've got a lot of stuff that isn't obvious on the surface, but it's a great tool for making sounds, and it's a great tool for really like kind of, particularly if you don't know what you're looking for and you're starting out with this kind of stuff, it's just lead with what you like, use the browser, get to something quite quickly, and just like try and use it to like kickstart an idea. It's a really nice way of doing that. Okay, cool. So let's say you're not using Alchemy. Let's say we want to use one of the other synths in Logic. So another really good one for this is, so just first of all, if you go to software instrument and click down here, you're going to see like a number of different synths going on down here. So the one that I wanted to turn to next is what's called retro synth. And I actually think this is one of the best synths, if not the best synth in Logic. So if I go to retro synth and press stereo and then go to create, I'm going to get a new channel and it's going to look like this. Now, these synths are basically, so retro synth is based on like a analog synth design, and analog synths work in a certain, particularly subtractive analog synths work in a certain way, which I'll explain in a second. But this design is pretty true to how it works in real life, in the sense of, you know, you've got to kind of manually set it up, and you've got to like acknowledge a signal path and all that stuff. So we'll talk about that in a second, but like the sounds themselves are really good in here. And it's a good opportunity for you to build really good dry synth sounds, because something that Alchemy does is that, you know, you might have a a dry synth sound, but it will also add delay, reverb, I don't know, glide. It's probably going to be adding like tremolo or something like that, and you know, it's doing a lot of that sound design work for you. So in retro synth, it gives you an opportunity to build like a really solid bass sound that you sorry, as in like a not bass like bass, I mean like base bass sound for you to then build off to make a more advanced synth sound. So let's have a look at this. So if you're new to synths, here's how synth works. So in a subtractive synth, what you've got is what's called an oscillator. So an oscillator makes the sound, and it does that by producing a wave. Now the waves can be different shapes, and when sound waves are different shapes, they make different sounds. So if you've got a smooth wave, like that sounds smooth, chances are it's what's called a sine wave, which is literally a smooth, like, you know, like you've kind of the classic drawing of a wave. But you've also got triangle, you've got square waves, which sound more abrasive because they're square. You've got what's called a sawtooth wave. So there are lots of different types of like basic oscillator. So if I go, for example, here, what this is showing me in this top left panel is my oscillators are 1 and 2, and I've got a mixer here between the two of them. So if I go to oscillator 1, I'm only listening to oscillator 1 at this point. So I'll press a note, that's what I'm hearing. So this is a sawtooth wave. So if I go to a square, two completely different sounds. So I can my first thing is to choose what kind of sound I want there, right? Also here you can kind of like offset the square a little bit so it becomes a bit lopsided, and you get this like really kind of like bitey sensation there. So you don't have to have a classic, you can kind of go into a more like almost like an FM space. But for the minute, we're going to stay there. The other option you've got with oscillator 1 here is noise. So a lot of, and this, if you're just starting out in synths, you might be like, why would you want noise? Because noise sounds like this. It's a tough sell, right? But the point here, you want noise because noise sounds natural, and like most things in nature that are like have broadband noise are pretty natural. Like a waterfall has broadband noise because you're basically just bombarding with sound. So if you blend something with noise, it can actually make it feel more like natural and less synthetic. It also just sounds cool as well, particularly if you're working in higher frequencies, because like, you know, using white noise and using noise in general is like a really it's quite an exciting thing, and it's something that really builds that kind of sense of excitement in the track sometimes. So you can use that for that as well. So let's just say for the minute we want to go with a square wave, right? And then I'm going to blend this with a second sound. So I'm going to go down to oscillator 2, and I'm going to choose, say, a triangle wave, which isn't available in my top one. That's a triangle wave. So let's say that's triangle, that's square. Triangle, square. So what I can do is I can blend these together. And now I've got a combination of the two oscillators. Now, depending on what synth you're using, like, you know, whether it's analog or it's another digital one, you know, you can have multiple oscillators going. So like, you know, Moogs famously will have up to, you know, like a sub 37 Moog has like 2 oscillators, a sub oscillator, and then a noise oscillator as well. So you could have a combination of 4. But you know, different synths have different combinations, and they'll also give you different choices of waves and all that kind of stuff. But the good thing is here is you can build like a sound that you want straight off the bat. Now the second section here is what's called a filter. So in subtractive synthesis, what happens with the filter is basically you're taking away part of the frequency range. So if I just open my filter up here, where are we? And press play, you can hear there's a lot of higher frequencies that were there before. Now, what a filter's doing is it's basically permanently removing part of the frequency range so that you're tailoring the tone of your sound. So if I want this to sound darker, I can bring this filter down, take out, so my high frequencies would be here. This is an EQ graph. And this low bit is what's being let through. So now it sounds like that. So you can feel it's a completely different tone. Like if I've got something moving down here, feels completely different, right? So I'm just going to leave that there. And that's basically going to allow me to just like have a different look at my sound. Now the thing with filters is that you've got different types of filters. So in the same way that if you're used to EQ, you've got like low cut, high cut, otherwise called high pass filter, low pass filter. Then what you can do here is you can basically go, okay, I'm going to change from LP, low pass, to HP, which would be the other way around. So, I mean, look, they've got these names like creamy gritty just because it's like the kind of shape that they're cutting, but like just try them out, they'll sound different. And the 6 dB, 12 dB, 24 dB is what's called the slope, and that's basically how steep the cut is that it's operating on. So if I take like we'll go with the creamy one, and if I raise this, you'll start to hear the bass fall out. So it might be that I just want the high energy to like kind of prop up another synth sound, for example. Or I could use two. I could have one synth that's like just holding down my lows, and I could bring in a second layer that's just holding down my highs. And, you know, I can design those two things differently because I've filtered them. I think a classic, well, I'd say a beginner mistake with layering will be to layer two completely broadband sounds on top of each other. So if you've got two bass sounds and you just layer the whole bass sound on top of each other unfiltered, you're going to, unless they're very, very complementary, you're going to end up with issues there because you're just loading energy into particularly your low end. Whereas with this, what you could do is you could say, okay, I'm going to have three layers. I'm going to have one with my lows, one with my mids, and one with my highs. And when you slot them all together, because you've designed them, they'll sound much more assertive because you're covering the whole frequency band range. Sorry, you're covering the whole frequency range, but you're doing it in a thought out way. So yeah, filters are a great way. The last filter that we're looking at here is what's called BP, which is band pass. So with this, you basically get both. So you can go like this. So I'm only going to listen to my mids now. Same thing. Like if you've done one with high and one with low, you might do one with band to hold your mids down, and then you've got like, you know, the whole frequency spectrum covered. Cool. So you can see at the bottom here you've got 3 other dials. We're going to come back to those, so remember those. But for the minute, we're going to just carry on. So you've got your volume here, and you've got your amp level here as well. And what this does is it will add a sub element to your track. Sub element to your synth sound, which is a sine wave. So you see where it says sine level? Earlier I was talking about the smooth sine waves. So your smooth sine wave is this. And what it will do is it will blend a third oscillator with your track and give you a bit of smooth sounding sine wave. See? So now, this is just an option if you want to smooth it out, but it's a good way, particularly if you're using bass sounds, and in particular drawing out bass sounds, to give that kind of like low end, like sub gravity, which is great. Okay, cool. So let's have a look at the next part. So a flanger is an effect, and we'll do that one last, just for the sake of building like a really good dry sound here. The next one is one that's like really popular. A lot of people don't realize that they're listening to glide when they hear it. This is also called portamento on some synths. Portamento coming from like the classical kind of tradition, you know, like pianissimo, fortissimo, that kind of stuff. So what this does is it basically slides between two notes. So if I turn my glide on, what I'm doing here at the time is I'm basically saying, okay, how long am I going to slide between these two notes? So if it's 0, it's not going to slide. It'll just go. That's what you'd expect, right? I'm just going to switch this back to a low pass filter just so that I've got like a bit more meat in my synth. But if I turn my time up on the glide, listen to what happens here. You can hear it now sliding between the two. And the longer I open it up, so this gives you a whole different like flavor to your synth. So if you pull this down, you can have a very percussive synth sound. It's like bum 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 bum, just completely on the rhythm. If I bring this even a little bit in, you're just going to feel more natural. Because it's kind of just like moving in like in a way that like legato players would on like on an instrument, right? You've also got opportunities here to basically only glide certain oscillators. So if I only want to glide like, well, as it says, if I want to glide like just oscillator 1 and my sine oscillator, which is here, so shape 1 and sine level, then I can just set it to that and it will only glide those two and leave oscillator 1 to just change as it would. You can hear that moving around in the background. So there's now two sounds going in layers. So it's an idea, but I mean, glide is all over music, in particular, like if you're using, it doesn't have to just be like, like analog synth stuff. I mean, if you're using like 808 samples or you're using like lead parts or whatever, like glide is going to just give you that feel of like movement. Yeah, so that's what glide does. Now, the bits at the bottom here, you might be like, okay, what the hell is this? This is like some kind of next graph stuff that I just do not understand. But the actual principle of it is quite simple. So on the left, you've got what are called LFOs, right? And they're called LFOs because it stands for low frequency oscillator. And that's quite a confusing term. So it basically sounds like it should be like low frequency, like that's low. And in some ways it is, because it's a low frequency, i.e. the time, like oscillate. It's a low frequency wave, and the slower the wave, the lower it is. But what it's doing here is you're basically using an LFO to push. You're putting one oscillator over the top of the other one, and it's basically going to move across the signal, which gives you the effect of it moving, pulsing with the oscillation. So an example of this would be if I turn my LFO up here, and I just set this, you should be able to hear. So I've got a very low frequency, i.e. like rate of frequency, oscillator there, and it's just moving across my other signal. So the oscillators up here are being influenced by this oscillator, which is then going to start creating movement. Now this is a really big one if you're trying to make like movement in your track and you're trying to give like a sense of like whether it's like pulsing or it's a sense of swing, it could be if you're trying to do that kind of thing. But like generally speaking, like you're going to want to like have your synths have at least some movement so they don't just sound like and it's just like completely flat. So in the same way with the oscillators up here, like because it's an oscillator, you can choose what kind of wave it is. So like if you set it to square, you're going to hear it's just going to change the nature of it. Very binary sound. Whereas triangle is more up down. So you can feel like already that you're creating two completely different things. So you've got sawtooth, more percussive, feels very different to this though, which is more like a tremolo. So that's a really nice like way of setting this up, and this is why I said I'll come back to these things here, right? Because in your filter, what I'm able to do is assign my LFO to my filter. So it's going to basically bring in, my what I've chosen here as my filter via the LFO. So if I, for example, you can hear when I bring the LFO in, it's not taking all the signal out. It's just bringing the highs out because that's what I've asked it to do. If I bring this all the way down, you can hear it's just influencing it as I'm using the filter. So the filter frequency that you've got here and the LFO are linked in this model. Okay, so it's a really nice. It's a really nice way of using synths, and in particular this one. But the great thing about this is that you and we'll come to this in a minute when we talk about like just how to make it feel a bit more analog. This is a good way of making it feel a bit more analog, and we'll come back to that. So this is one thing. Now another great touch with this, which you don't have on a lot of particularly old synths, is a sync function. So on modern synths, if you're as in analog synths, if you're using a MIDI controller, what will happen is that basically your DAW will inform your synth of what your BPM is. Of it will basically inform it of what's called a clock, right? So it will basically say, I'm working to this time, you should work on this time as well. And what that allows you to do is sync stuff. But older synths didn't have that. They didn't even have MIDI. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to by ear pretty much just dial in what you like heard was the right rate. And there's a real kind of beauty to that as well, because it is, if something's slightly off like that, it can also create a great feel. But in here, you've got what's called sync. So I can basically turn this. See, when it's off, I've got to choose my actual wave frequency. Whereas when it's on, it becomes a lot more intuitive, because I can be like, okay, it's a quarter note. I understand that. I know that my BPM, if I press play, 1, 2, it's just a fourth note. I can get it faster if I want by just dragging it up to an eighth. And it's funny because when you listen to this stuff, particularly if you're new to synths or you're new to like this whole world of sound design, which is a giant rabbit hole, just to kind of be honest about that. And I think one of the decisions you've got to make is like, how much time do I actually want to spend on this? But you should hear quite quickly that a lot of the stuff that I'm showing you here, you're like, oh yeah, I recognize that kind of sound from X, So like, this kind of thing, you can instantly hear like a kind of strange of Things-esque vibe going on here with the kind of big synth sound. It's quite dry. You've got the Lfos on it. It's, you're starting to feel that kind of effect. Okay, cool. So, and then on the other hand, you've got what's called vibrato, and vibrato is just a volume-based thing. So this will basically just move. What am I doing here? Sorry. You can feel I'm also introducing like another level of mixing these two together. So I can bring a different rate of vibrato in addition to my LFO. Now I'm really kind of starting to create like a movement now. So one's in 4, one's in 16. In 8 triplets. So you beforehand, that was quite a boring part. Like I basically just had, if I turn this down, that's my single note. As soon as I start to bring the vibrato in, I've now introduced rhythm to that, and I've introduced like a bit of a sway with the two different rhythms. So you're just creating a much more interesting synth part there, like straight away. Okay, cool. So hopefully you kind of understand roughly what that section does at least. Now the other thing you can do is on the bottom right, you've got these two graphs, and these are what are called envelopes. Now an envelope is all about time. And it's about how something behaves over time. So in this case, you can see that you've got 4 settings. So top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. And they're labeled ADSR. And ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. And what this means is it's the way that something happens over time. So if, for example, you have an attack of 0, it means that whatever it is you're assigning that envelope will happen straight away. Then you've got this kind of this bit here where it falls off after the attack. So this would be your decay, right? Is how quickly it kind of goes from the attack point or the transient down to a sustained point. So that line, the second line there, is your decay. Then the sustained line, i.e. this held line here, is this value here. So basically it will allow you to choose how long it sustains for. And then finally you've got your release, which is how long it takes for the note to fade out once released. So it's a very like, this appears all over the place in production and in sound design. And basically what you've got is in this particular instance, you've got 2 envelopes, one for your amp, which is the output of the whole synth, and one for your filter, which is just for the filter up here. Okay, so if I think for the sake of just of getting you to understand what this does, let's just look at the amp one for a minute. Okay, so in simple terms, if I press this, I'm just going to turn this down for a second. Okay, so this is my envelope. Okay, so this is, I'll come back to why this is happening in a second. So that's what my filter sounds like, right? Now, what I'm going to do now is basically change my attack on here. You feel that going? So it's not just going straight away. It's coming in gradually over time. And that's what the attack does. So if I don't want it to be straight away, and in particular normally in a lot of synths to have that kind of popping quality that comes in with that level of attack, I can soften this up and create a much more like, sounds a bit more like an organ now. Whereas if I play that again, you can feel the kind of like transient attack coming in on that attack. So that's one way of doing it. Now, what I was saying before is the decay, right? Is how long does it take for it to go from the attack point down to the sustain point? And what we're doing here is basically we're saying, okay, like how steeply does this happen? So to exaggerate this point, if I make it very short and I make my sustain point very low, you can see what's going to happen here, right? It's going to go very loud and then very quiet very quickly. That's probably too quick because you can barely hear that. You can feel it going, bow, so you can kind of see it, do it, you can hear it, in fact, doing what you're seeing on this envelope, which is a very fast attack, very loud, then it goes very quickly down the decay, and then down to the sustain point. And then, finally, I've got my release. And I've let go of this now. So if I push this up, just so you can hear it, so it's going to take 10 seconds for the synth to slowly let the volume go in the amp. So what you should be able to see here is that you can change very quickly the kind of sound that you're working on. So if I want to just like choose something like this, I've moved that so quickly from a sound that was basically just like a kind of big fat synth sound, which that's what it originally sounded like, and I've moved it to something that feels a lot more plucked, almost like a string instrument. And that's just using my envelope, my amp envelope. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're going to do one thing with all of this stuff that I've told you, don't forget how much your amp envelope can really change like the quality of something. So if you open up a synth and you're like, I don't like that sound, don't write it off straight away. What you might be looking for is an envelope, not an oscillator or a filter. Because particularly if it's a kind of it's about the quality of the like percussive nature of the synth. Like if you want like a big sweeping open synth, then obviously your envelope's not really going to change that, right? Whereas if you want something that's quite tight and has like a percussive feel to it, and needs to be kind of like moving quite quickly, then your amp envelope is going to really help you achieve that. So yeah, don't write it off. The other thing is, let's look at where your envelope can be applied to another setting. So if you are someone who is using Serum, or you're using something like Massive or a more advanced synth, basically, Alchemy does the same thing. What you'll see is that you've got envelopes which are applied to another setting. So in this case, what's happening is my filter is controlled by my filter envelope. So what that means is that I will be able to control how quickly the filter takes effect. So at the moment, actually I'll reset this just so it's a bit of a less, yeah, that was my old synth sound, right? So what I can do here is the more I push into this, see, the envelope. So you can feel it going up and then down to the sustain. If I really exaggerate these, you can start to play with how your filter and your envelope interact, right? So again, like if you're picking a filter and you feel like you don't necessarily want it to just be static, obviously your LFO is a good option for that. That's cool. But like, and that will create movement over time. But like, this is a good way of just creating like a kind of percussive and like time-based approach to your filters. So so yeah, that's retro synth. So you'll notice up here that I'm in the analog setting of retro synth. Actually, before we carry on, I forgot to go into Flanger. So I'm not going to go too much into what Flanger is, but the long and short of it is that basically if you take two signals, if you take the same signal and you copy it, and you put one slightly later than the other, and you basically move it slightly in and out of time, what happens is you create a kind of sweeping effect, like. So there's a family of effects that are very closely linked, which is flanger, phase, and chorus, and they all play with that effect. They play with the fact that if you put two things like in and out of time with each other, they kind of start to create like a phasing effect, and you get that kind of sound. That's, in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about here. So if I put the flanger right in, can you hear it going? So it's just another way of introducing like a bit of flavour to your sound here. And what you would want to do ideally here is you would want to make this rate, which is what whenever you see something that's in hertz, you're dealing with whenever you see something on a synth that's in hertz, you're normally dealing with what's called a rate, right? And the rate is the frequency at which something happens. So in this case, you're dealing with 1.4 hertz, which is a very slow wave. So it's going to be like it's just going to create a movement. Now in this case, it's kind of difficult to tell what what that rate would need to be. So there's a couple of ways that you can figure it out. First one would be to use your sync option here. So if I know that I've synced my thing to a quarter note, I can turn back and see what the rate would be, and then I can apply that there. Another way is actually in Logic, you've got this little function here. So if you go to region at the top left and you click on delay, you can actually see like all of your different times here. And I thought that had rate, but it doesn't. But you are able to use like converters and things online to either move from milliseconds to rate, or if you put your milliseconds to hertz, or if you put your BPM in, you can also like calculate from like an eighth note what the milliseconds and what the hertz of the like wave that would be that time would be. So like there's a couple of options to do that if you're stuck, and it's just a good idea to kind of like start thinking about your rate and any kind of timings like these, your attack timings, your decay timings, as denominations of your BPM. It's a really big step if you can do that, because like if you're coming to this as a beginner and you're looking at something like Glide and you're just like, oh, it's just like 14 milliseconds. I don't know. Is that the right amount of milliseconds? Like, is it 14 or 15 milliseconds? Like, obviously you can do it by ear, but if you can, like, try and get it to a place where you like it by ear, and then you could be like, okay, well, what's it closest to in terms of my denomination to my BPM? So if it's, for example, closest to, in this case, like a 96th, which would be 20 milliseconds, you might want to put it there. Now that's quite a small amount of time, so it probably wouldn't make that much of a difference. Whereas if you're dealing with a longer amount of time, like 125, if you're at 115, try at 125, and you'll probably find is that it will move more in time, which will help you to build something that feels more coherent. So whenever, even not just in synths, with everything else, reverbs, the whole like compression, release times, everything, like try and think about time in Logic as related to your BPM, and try and always bring it back to that. And if you can, and frankly you've got the you've got the time and energy, try and convert it to like, you know, a denomination of your BPM in the way that I just showed you. So yeah, so that is your kind of whip through of retro synth. You've also got a chorus effect in here as well, which gives you a different flavour. Now a lot of this will basically give you the illusion that there's multiple synths playing at the same time, in a nutshell. But it's a really nice way of creating width as well in your track, because what it will basically do is pan, if I'm right in this one, it will pan left and right a copy of the synth, and then detune it and bring it slightly out of time, so it feels like the kind of whole thing is just like a group of synths playing. It's an effect, try it out, but it's a pretty classic effect on most synths. Now you can also see back here, right, you've also got different types of synth. Now I won't go into sync modulation on this one because that's just not useful, but you've got what's called a wave table on here as well. Wave tables are like very, very popular at the moment, particularly because Serum, which is like a very leading synth, basically is, you know, has for the most part is using wave tables. And what it basically does is it models other, whereas in a normal synth, sorry, in a subtractive analog synth, you've got like square wave, triangle wave, all that stuff. Wavetable basically models the wave on other stuff, which means that there's essentially infinite different types of wave that you can have. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, if you're new to this, go into Wavetable, try some of these out, see what they sound like. They will sound different to your analog basic sounds like square, triangle, sine, that kind of stuff. So it's another tool that they're giving you here. You can see the other stuff is the same. Like pretty much everything apart from the oscillator on this is the same, right down to the chorus effect. The only advantage you've got here is that you can basically go in and choose what you want in here as your sound. So I could go in and say like, what's morphing harmonics? You see, that's not what a square or a triangle sounds like. Resonance sweep. Another thing about a wavetable is that it changes over time as well, which is nice. So anyway, that's in there. The other thing is what's called FM as well. Now this is getting into, again, like another level of synthesis, but an FM synth basically uses two oscillators, but it puts one across the other, so it combines two. But the point with this is that you've got another tool in here for free. So you're not just dealing with like this kind of like wooden old boring granddad synth. You've also got like table and FM in there as well, wavetable and FM if you want to use anything like that going forward. So yeah, my kind of like sales pitch with this is, don't write off RetroSynth because it is a really good tool. The other thing that we were talking about earlier, just to kind of spice your synth sounds up, was arpeggiators. And arpeggiators are really good tools, and there are many MIDI tools to help you work with synths. And you can do this with any MIDI effect in Logic. But if you haven't done it before, check out your MIDI effects. Here's your signal path in your channel, goes top to bottom. So, for example, you would start with whatever your instrument is, and it goes down for your audio effects for your sends. But you'll notice that there's actually one before the instrument, and you might think, how can there be something before the instrument? Well, what this is doing is this is basically informing your triggers for the instrument. So your MIDI effects, of which there are about 8 there, include an arpeggiator. So if I turn on the Logic Arpeggiator and I press a note, you will notice that it will keep playing that same note at the rate of a 16th, because that's what the rate's set to. So if I play a chord in the bass, I've now got like a moving bass line there. I could also like set it to triplet, for example. And if you've got like something moving in 4 over the top of that, so let's just try and like kind of like give an example with this, right? Oh no, didn't want to do that. Sorry, 1 second. That's what happens when you're too hasty with deleting channels. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to bring in like a drummer track in, and we'll just set it to like electronic. Doesn't really matter what it is for the minute. Okay, cool. So like arpeggiators are a good way of letting you experiment with other rhythms as well. So obviously if you're playing in 16s, that's kind of instantly just like giving you motion and energy. Now I'm just in 4s across it. Sorry, in 8s even. If I go to 8 triplet, I'm going to start to get a bit of bounce. Or 8 dotted, it's going to give me a different feel as well. Where are we? Sorry. Gives you that kind of bounce structure to it. So you can actually use your arpeggiator to like just program in rhythms as well if you're trying to get like something like that in time. You could use note repeat as well, but this is a nice way of doing it. The other thing you can do with this is you can play a chord and do the same thing as you did in Alchemy. So it'll go up, down. Let's make it faster so it doesn't sound ridiculous. So I could do that kind of same thing if I wanted to. Cool. So, and the other thing that I just mentioned about MIDI effects, I've done it again, haven't I? Deleted the wrong channel. Is that you've got so a handy one for beginners in here as well is Transposer. Now, the reason I mentioned Transposer is that if you're not a confident pianist, so I'm a guitarist first and foremost, right? So all my theory, understanding of intervals, all that stuff in my head is on a guitar. So whenever I'm playing another instrument, which I normally can do because I have like a good understanding of like, you know, harmony, theory, that kind of stuff, I am normally kind of working it back from guitar theory, right? But what you'll probably figure out is that like to do production on any level, you're pretty much going to need to play keys at some point, right? Like, you're not going to get away from that one. And one of the hardest things with synths or whatever it is, if you're trying to find like something that fits, is trying to play the keyboard and be like, okay, well, which notes are in this key? So it's fine when you're in A minor or C major, because if you know much about theory, those are all the white keys basically. But as soon as you start moving out of that into, you know, even the simple ones like G, for example, which only has one black key, as it were, like then basically you're still having to like know what those scales are to be able to get something that fits. Now what Transposer does is it allows you to play in one key and it will transpose it into another key for you. And the great thing about this is normally if you're not a confident player or you're not a confident, rephrase that, you're not a confident pianist, then what you can do is you can figure out what your key is. So if it was, say, G major, and you wanted to play in C major, then what you can do is go, okay, I'm going to move down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 semitones, or up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I can either push this up 5 semitones or down 7 semitones. So if I play the same part, and I now push it up, I'm still playing the same notes on the keyboard. It's moving them around for me. So this will help you if you're trying to find, like, if you're trying to play parts on synths or whatever, and you don't want to have to constantly go back and write in the MIDI, and you actually want to play it, but you just want to be able to play it in a key that you know, normally A minor or C major. This will help you to do that. Cool. So, oh, dog's gone mad. See, he agrees. All right, cool. So the last thing we're going to do with this is I just said earlier I would talk to you a little bit about how to make your sounds a little bit more real, or a little bit like a bit more like how you would play an analog synth. One of the things with analog synths that are a real joy to play, but also one of the reasons that they sound so like natural and fluid, is because people do play them like instruments. So like when you're playing it, you're not just playing like the keys, you're also playing like the filters, you're playing like the modulations, modulations being something like LFO, for example. You're playing, you know, you could play with the glide, you could play with the way that the mix between the oscillators. You know, there's all this stuff that you can like bring out in a synth that you can't really do if you've just got like a static thing. And I think one of the things that like software, but in particular like software synths, leaves you prone to is just kind of assuming that like the synth should just be static. So like if I make a synth sound or I go to a preset and I'm like, okay, synth bass. Sorry, if you didn't know presets are up here. So use a default. And then you can choose some sounds down here. Like that's my sound, right? But you might just be like, okay, well that's what I'm going to play with, and you will just play a part in like that. Whereas what you're more likely to do on a real synth is actually play with the tone and the sound design of the part over time. So what I propose with this that you should do is you should use automation to modulate your synth sounds over time. So an example of this would be like, let's just take a quick recording of a part, right? I'm just going to make one up. Absolute shit. Let me start again. Sorry. What's wrong with me? Long day. Sorry. cool. We'll start there. Okay, so what you could do now is you could start moving this using automation, bringing in a different tone. What happens if we glide it? Then open up your amp. So you can see I'm moving the tone like ever so slightly each time, and it's basically just giving me like a little bit more of my tone, like every single time it comes round. Classic one, opening your filter up. So if you're not used to using automation, here's a quick intro to automation which you can take away and play with. So if you press A, you go into automation mode, and what you can do is you can start to write in automation using the touch or the latch settings. Now for this kind of thing I would recommend using latch, because what that will do is, so the difference between touch and latch is if I pull this up on touch and let go, it will snap back to the middle position, whereas with latch, if I pull it up and let go, it will stay there. And that's kind of more what I want to do here, because I want to like work with my sound over time, right? So I'm going to just switch it to latch, and because I'm on a loop, it's going to change each time it comes round. So I'm just going to make small adjustments, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this loop up. I'm just going to kind of play with this over time and just make changes as I would if I were playing a real synth, and it should just allow me to design my part better. So I'm going to start small and I'm going to build it up. Bring my filter in, my envelope. Okay, so now I'm going to go for a softer sound. Bit more of a janky kind of thing. So you can feel how I'm just changing it over and over again, right? So one idea here would be, you can see that everything that I've done there has been written in automation. Didn't play with the resonance, cut off, glide, that kind of stuff. It's all being written in. And then if I had a part that I really liked that I've like automated over time, obviously in a real track you might be playing along to the track to make sure it actually felt right. You can then convert this to audio and just treat it as a stem, rather than keeping it in MIDI. And that's kind of truer to how a synth, like an analog synth, would be played if you're recording it in audio, because you're not able to just constantly go back and make changes on it. Like, you've got to commit. So I guess that's what I'm saying, is maybe just try and think of it less like a static software piece of software, and think of it more like an instrument that you can play over time with automation, to make something that like moves and feels different at different points in the track, because that's how you get something that feels really interesting and feels really natural. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there. The very last thing that I realised that I didn't mention earlier was what is resonance. Look, I just realised that I didn't do that. So you can see here this little resonance dial on my filter. What resonance is basically a boost at the point of the cutoff filter. So if you're cutting off at, in this case, 400 Hertz, then I can boost at 400 Hertz. And that basically produces like an OTT version of that filter. So if I... gives you quite a house kind of sounding like sound. See the difference? So yeah, that's just food for thought, but I thought I'd add that in because I mentioned at the beginning and I promised I would. So yeah, I've been kind. This has been how to use some ideas for how to use synths in Logic, and which is on Garnish TV. Garnish TV runs every day from all over the world with all different instructors from one of our many different sites. So there's schools in America, we've got schools in the UK, and we're soon to have schools in Europe as well. So yeah, if you want any more information, just go to our website, garnishmusicproduction.com, and thanks for joining us.